Hello everyone, this is Jeff with Mississippi and the Civil War. Welcome back for episode 3 on life in Mississippi during the war. And this episode is going to focus on what life was like for the common soldier of the Confederacy during the conflict. And I'm sorry it's taken me so long to get this episode going. I had to face a really nasty sinus infection over the last week, and boy, it put me down for a good solid week. I'm just now getting my voice back to where I can speak, so hopefully the rest of the episodes will be coming at a much quicker pace. But I hope you enjoy this little series I've been doing. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you'd like to see more content like this, really subscriptions and likes are kind of let me gauge how much people like this material and how much content I should try to produce. So please just let me know your comments and questions, and I look forward to your feedback. So let's go ahead and get started. And this is a good representative drawing of a Confederate soldier during the war. And for most Confederate soldiers, combat took up just a very small part of their time as a soldier. For every day spent in combat, soldiers spent weeks or even months in camp or on the march. And for the most part, a lot of the life they were leading during the war was very boring. It was tedious. There was a lot of daily routine with a lot of hard work. And we're just going to talk about how the soldiers spent their time when they weren't in combat. Now, this is a good representation of the layout of a Confederate Army camp. And Army regulations called for Civil War camps to be laid out in a fixed grid pattern with officers' quarters to the front end of each street and enlisted men's quarters aligned to the rear. The camp was set up roughly along the lines of the regiment would draw up in a line of battle. But you had a specific place for everything. That's where, there would be no question as, during the night or when things were crazy, where people were and where to find them. But these kind of layouts were very common during the war. Now, in the summer, soldiers generally slept in canvas tents. And early in the war, very large ones were used that could hold, up to 20 men or more. As the conflict went on, tents tended to get smaller, more common ones housing anywhere from 2 to 4 men. When they were on campaign, soldiers often used no tents at all, often just sleeping under blankets and maybe with a ground cloth under them, between them and the ground. If the weather was bad, soldiers might build an improvised shelter from blankets or from ground cloths that was commonly known by the slang term shebang. But these are some interesting little illustrations done by Frank Foote of the 48th Mississippi Infantry. He was from Claiborne County, fought in the 48th Mississippi, part of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he just illustrated some of the various types of shelters that the Confederate soldiers built during his time in the Army. And they could be everything from a very simple tent all the way up to almost a fixed cabin with a fly for a roof. And soldiers use anything and everything in between. And but as the war went on, the shelters tended to get a little more simple, particularly when the men were on extended marches. They just didn't have time to build anything very elaborate, or in a lot of cases didn't have time to build much of anything at all. But when they were in a fixed camp, the average soldier's day began about 5 a.m. during the summer and about 6 a.m. in the winter. The men were awakened by reveille, and after a roll call was taken to account for all of the men, breakfast was usually eaten, and then the soldiers prepared for as many as the first of 5 drills in a day. They really pounded drill into these men whenever they had the time. And there was a good reason for this. The During the Civil War, these men were expected to perform in battle a very highly choreographed, close order tactics that had changed very little from Napoleon's time. And all of this drill was really needed to perfect these maneuvers that had to be done very precisely and under a great deal of stress when you're in the middle of combat. And so the men had to learn how to move, how to position their weapons correctly, and and particularly how to maneuver in very large groups. And that is not something that's easy to do. I can tell you from experience. I was a Civil War reenactor for over a decade, and trying to march in unison with hundreds of other men takes a lot of practice. It is not easy. And it's in fact, it's very easy to mess it up. And it doesn't take long for a line of battle to become a disordered mob if you don't know what you're doing. But Adjutant James R. Benford, and this is a post-war picture of him up in the upper left-hand corner here. He was an officer in the 15th Mississippi Infantry, and he described the process of teaching drill to new soldiers in his regiment in the early days of the war. And he said, "We remained in camp about 6 weeks, drilling twice each day. The officers and men all being raw recruits, discipline was very galling to them, and as they would be brought under rigid military discipline, a large amount of first-class swearing could be heard every day." And I heard there was another Mississippi officer that described this early process of trying to of officers and trying to teach equally green men drill. He described it as the ignorant teaching the uneducated, and that's probably a pretty apt description. It took a lot of practice for these guys to become seasoned veterans to be able to maneuver and fire competently under fire. In between bouts of drilling, soldiers had lots of duties they had to carry out. They had to clean the camp. They had to build roads. They had to dig trenches for latrines. They had to gather wood for cooking and heating. They had to find clean water. That was particularly important because tainted water led to lots of disease and intestinal problems for the men. While they were in camps, the men tended to band together and form small groups for cooking food, because generally there were no designated cooks in a Civil War camp. The men were issued their rations raw, and they were expected to prepare their own food. So most soldiers would band together in groups of anywhere from 3 or more men, and they would call this group a mess, and they would share what food they had and prepare a communal meal. Soldiers tended to mess with their friends and their relatives, so these groups were generally pretty close, and the loss of a member of your mess would be felt very closely by the group. And as the war progressed, Mississippi soldiers saw their rations reduced, particularly as the strains of the conflict made it difficult to provide enough food for the men in the field. It was especially difficult trying to keep them fully fed while they were in the middle of a campaign. At these times, Mississippians saw little beef, very few vegetables. They subsisted for the most part on things like salt pork, dried beans, cornbread, hardtack. In fact, hardtack was probably one of the greatest staples that a soldier would have. It was nothing more than a flour and water biscuit. It was very hard, had very little taste, but it would keep for a long time. As long as you kept them dry, they would basically keep for just about ever. So that was something that was easy to transport and get to the men in the field. Now, observers often commented on how lean the Confederate soldiers looked, but the lack of food really didn't diminish their fighting spirit. During the Antietam campaign in 1862, a civilian in Frederick, Maryland, said of the Confederates who marched through the town, "They were the dirtiest men I ever saw, a most ragged, lean, and hungry set of wolves. Yet there was a dash about them that the Northern men lacked." Now, to make up for their lack of rations, hungry Mississippians were often forced to live off the land. Fighting on their home ground, the Confederacy tried very hard to curb outright thievery, but and a lot of civilians did actively support the Army, providing freely to the soldiers, but it was not uncommon at all for Confederate soldiers to sneak out of camp and steal from local farmers and from local homes, stealing things like chickens, hogs, honey from beehives, you name it. If there was a Confederate Army camped near your farm, sooner or later you were going to start missing foodstuffs. It was just inevitable. With their rations being so reduced, Confederate soldiers were going to make up the difference as best they could, whether it was by hook or by crook. And another big problem that Confederate soldiers faced was, even when they had food, they often didn't have the proper utensils to cook it properly. This was especially true again when they were on the march and couldn't carry a lot of excess weight with them. Sergeant George P. Clark of the 36th Mississippi Infantry described in his memoir how his mess overcame their lack of utensils to cook a meal. And he said, "We found on arrival that orders had been issued to prepare 3 days' rations, which took nearly all night owing to the lack of cooking utensils. I remember that I had to bake my bread that night on an old broken fire shovel, hoe cake fashion. Soldiers were often reduced to wonderful straits in this respect, for the provisions were often dished out to us when we had nothing to cook it in, and we could hunt up something, we could cook it in the ashes, or we could devour it raw, just as we saw proper." And shown in the picture here is just a good sampling of the very basic types of items that soldiers would use for cooking their food. And a lot of these are just field-made expedients, like taking half of a canteen and poking holes in it, and you can use it for grating food. You could also use it as a makeshift skillet. You've got just plates and cups, boilers, coffee pots, just very simple utilitarian items that soldiers could easily make or carry with them. And spending so much of their time in camp, soldiers got very bored. Monotony was a common part of the soldier's life, and the men had to do something to try and just relieve the boredom. And the exchange of letters with family members and friends at home was very important to these men who were, a lot of them, away from home for the very first time. The Civil War began just a wave of letter writing in Mississippi that has probably never been equaled since. And as a consequence, we do have a rich documentary history about the lives of these Civil War soldiers from all the letters that they wrote. And it really can't be overstated how important it was for Civil War soldiers to receive mail from family and friends. And a good example of this is Dr. Robert H. Peel of the 19th Mississippi Infantry. In June of 1861, he wrote to his sister-in-law and just begged her to write him. And he said to her, "Oh, sis, if you could only know how a soldier appreciates a letter from home, when he scarcely expects to see the dear spot again, or to grasp once more the hands of kindred and friends, you would certainly find time to write me often, if you could only know how deeply I feel the disappointment when each evening our postboy returns to camp without a letter or word from me." And a lot of soldiers wrote very similar sentiments back home to their families, just asking them, "Please write me more often. Let me know what's going on. Tell me what's happening on the farm." They were just desperate for any kind of relief from the monotony and the homesickness. Excuse me. Now, one common theme in the letters sent from home were warnings about the evils of camp life. And within a camp, there existed just about every vice known to man. And for many new recruits, these vices were just about irresistible. You had gambling, drinking, profanity. They were all very common. So soldiers were constantly receiving reminders from home that you better stay on the straight and narrow. And one example of this, J.A. Gillespie wrote to her brother William Allen, who was a private in the 38th Mississippi Infantry, and she told him, "Oh, William, let me entreat you to beware the sins of the camp. Do not be tempted to join in them. Remember you have an angel wife in heaven, and your heart's desire is to go to her. Be a true Christian, and perhaps you may influence others to do right." And although gambling was very popular in camp, you also had very popular revivals of religion in the camps. Each Mississippi regiment had its own chaplain. Most of them were Protestant, although there were some Catholic chaplains in various regiments in the state. And religious activity in the camps really increased in 1863 when there were a wave of revivals that swept through the Confederate armies. Pinckney Johnston, who was the chaplain of the 38th Mississippi Infantry, wrote of the religious fervor that was sweeping through his regiment when he said, "We have had for the past week very interesting prayer meetings. They were well attended and the very highest interest manifested. Souls are hungry for the bread of life. Often in these prayer meetings there are from 12 to 20 mourners. There have already been 2 or 3 conversions, and 4 have joined the church. Sinners are being awakened, mourners comforted, and Christians established in the faith." And during the Civil War, commanders on both sides tried to avoid large-scale movements of men during the winter months. Consequently, when winter weather hit, offensive operations were generally suspended, and the men were allowed to establish what was known as winter quarters. Generally, they would try and create a more stable, more permanent type of housing, such as the cabin seen here that these Texas soldiers built. And they would also build up a lot more clothing and blankets and things that they normally couldn't carry with them, just to try and make themselves more comfortable during the winter. And so it was very common, as soon as the soldiers started going into winter quarters, to see them start building really, some of them, very impressive shelters to keep them comfortable during the long cold winter. Now, when the soldiers were on active campaigning, they suffered probably more than any other time. The men couldn't carry much with them in the way of food or equipment, and often the commissary was slow in bringing food up to the men in the ranks, and the men were exposed to the cold, to the mud, to the blistering heat, to the dust, and basically all you had to protect yourself from the elements was what you could carry with you. Perhaps you might have a ground cloth, a blanket, maybe a tent fly, all rolled up and worn over the shoulder in a blanket roll. And it's not very much, but that's really the most you could carry with you on a day-to-day basis. Perhaps about 40, maybe 50 pounds of gear. It was not a lot, but that's the most you could really carry without just wearing yourself out. And the greatest threat that soldiers really faced while they were serving in the Army was not enemy bullets, it was disease. Most Mississippi soldiers came from rural backgrounds. Most had never been exposed to common childhood diseases that were pretty common to city-raised soldiers. And consequently, when they got into Army camps for the first time and were exposed to large groups, the casualties from disease were just staggering. During the course of the war, an estimated 164,000 Confederate soldiers died of disease. And during the first months of a typical Mississippi regiment service, it was not uncommon for half the men in a unit to be unfit for duty because of sickness. They were struck by communicable diseases such as measles, mumps, chicken pox, whooping cough, and by other diseases such as malaria and typhoid. To give you an example of how disease could just decimate a unit, let me read you some statistics from a unit I'm very familiar with, 38th Mississippi Infantry, the unit I did my regimental history on. From 1862 to 1865, 1,354 men served in the 38th. Of that number, 218 died of disease, more than twice the number of men who died in combat. Of the 218 who died of disease, 190 of those died in the first 9 months of the unit's service during their initial exposure to new diseases. That's just how deadly it was to be a soldier from a rural background coming into an army camp for the first time. Now, for soldiers that were wounded in combat, bullet wounds accounted for approximately 93% of battlefield injuries. Artillery accounted for about 6%, and those from sabers or bayonets less than 1%. Usually, friends or litter bearers would carry those that became casualties from the field back to field hospitals. Usually, casualties would be taken to a very close by field hospital where they were sorted. The slightly wounded who could wait from those needing immediate attention, and those that were fatally wounded who would just be made comfortable. For Mississippians who were wounded in a limb, 3 out of 4 cases ended in amputation. Usually the soldier was given some form of anesthesia before the operation, the preferred method being chloroform. It was administered by putting a soaked sponge or cloth over the patient's nose until they were unconscious. And an example of a soldier that had to have an amputation was Lieutenant Colonel William L. Brandon of the 21st Mississippi Infantry. He was wounded in the leg at the Battle of Malvern Hill, Virginia, and had to have his leg amputated. And he later wrote this account of the amputation. He said, "On examining the wound, there was no doubt of the propriety of an immediate amputation. I asked if he had chloroform, and he said yes and proceeded. When I felt the tourniquet tighten on my leg, I called to him. I was not under the influence of chloroform. He said he had no more and asked if he should proceed. I replied, off with it. I supposed I could stand it. The operation was performed in an inconceivable short time, but the pain was horrible, particularly the tying up of the arteries." And William, despite this gruesome account, he did survive his amputation, and which is really kind of amazing considering he was very advanced in age at the time of his wounding. He was nearly 60 years old, but he did survive the amputation. He was never able to return to his unit, but he did survive and lived another 20 years. And many soldiers from Mississippi who were captured ended up having to spend time in Union prisoner of war camps. Life in these camps could often be just as difficult as serving in combat, only the difficulties were more exposure, disease, and again, boredom. During the first 2 years of the war, very few Mississippians were held prisoner, at least for very long, because most were paroled after capture. And parole was a system where the Union and Confederacy would swap prisoners after they were captured. In 1863, the parole system broke down, and it was at that time that large numbers of Confederates were sent to hastily built northern prisoner of war camps. Living conditions in these camps could be very difficult. The South, for its prisoner of war camps, didn't have the resources to properly feed, clothe, or house the thousands of prisoners that they held, and in a lot of cases the North would retaliate against the Confederate soldiers that they held, making life very difficult for the men in these camps. Now, there was one Union prisoner of war camp on Mississippi soil. In 1864, Union authorities began sending captured rebels to Ship Island off the Mississippi coast. The camp operated from October 1864 to June 1865, and during that time, over 5,000 Confederates were held prisoner on the island. And this is a nice illustration of Harper's Weekly done during the war, showing Ship Island. And this is a modern photograph of Fort Massachusetts, which is located on Ship Island, and that's where the Union garrison was that would have guarded the prisoners. Now, Ship Island was very barren at the time of the Civil War. Conditions for the prisoners there were pretty bad. One Union soldier said of the island, "This is the most desolate place I ever saw. It's nothing but a heap of sand surrounded by water, no vegetation or whatsoever I could see." And during the course of the war, 214,000 Confederates were sent to northern prisons, and about 25,976 died. Union death rates in southern prisons were about the same. Of the 194,000 Union prisoners who spent time in Confederate prisons, 30,024 died. So in the end, the death rates were pretty comparable, whether you were in a northern prisoner of war camp or a southern prisoner of war camp. They were both unpleasant places that you really didn't want to be in. And this concludes my talk today on the life of the common soldier, which is good because I'm still not quite recovered from this sinus problem and my voice is about to give out. I hope you enjoyed episode 3. If you did, please give it a thumbs up or a like. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and you like this content, please subscribe because it does help me to gauge interest in doing more episodes like this. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I will hopefully have the next episode out very soon. Thank you very much.